imam čast da najavim specijalnog gosta jubilarnog Kopaonik Biznis foruma, gospodina Indermit Gila. Gospodin Gil je stariji potpredsjednik Svetske banke i ujedno glavni ekonomista Svetske banke grupe. Gospodin Gil ima veliko iskustvo radeći sa vladama zemalja u razvoju na pitanjima makroekonomskih neravnoteža, rastu, smanjenju siromaštva, izgradnje institucija, klimatskim promenama. Poznat je i nadaleko cenjen po svom doprinosu ekonomiji razvoja, a posebno po uvođenju koncepta zamke srednjeg dohotka, gde je opisao kako zemlje, nakon dostizanja određenog nivoa prihoda, stagniraju. Takođe, njegovi objavljeni radovi tangiraju ključna politička pitanja zemalja u razvoju, između ostalog ranjivost javnog duga, tržište rada, siromaštvo i nejednakost, zeleni rast. Gospodin Gil je, pored angažmana u Svetskoj banci, bio i profesor javnih politika na Duke univerzitetu. Predavao je i na Georgetown univerzitetu i univerzitetu u Čikagu. Gospodine Gil, izvolite.
Thank you very much. And it seems that everybody was just here to hear the central bank governor, because it seems everybody is leaving except the central bank governor. I should start as people are starting to get ready. But I want to start by saying thank you very much to Mr. Vlahovic and the organizers for this opportunity for us at the World Bank to be here in beautiful Kopaonik and share our assessments of the global economy, the policy implications for developing economies, and what countries like Serbia ought to be doing. I also want to thank the governor for those useful remarks. She has done all the heavy lifting for me, so I can actually start to tell some stories instead of showing you all these complicated numbers, and she did that very well. I also have to thank MasterCard, because I'm from the World Bank, and we are all likely to be carrying MasterCard instead of Visa and American Express soon. That is an inside joke. I think only the MasterCard people and the World Bank people might get that one. So I must also thank my World Bank colleagues, especially Nicola Pontara, our country manager, and Richard Record, our lead economist, and Gordana Filipovic for helping me get ready for this discussion. But most of all, of course, I would like to thank all of you for being here, those who have stayed, because without you, there will be no discussion and no learning. So my talk today is actually based on the work of economists at the World Bank, our regional, global, and our country teams. So let me see if I can work these slides now. All right, so I'm going to talk about these three things. So first, I'll briefly tell you about the state of the global economy, and speaking succinctly, it's not good. Okay? So I'm sure that you don't need me to tell you that, but unlike other people who come from the World Bank and the IMF and other places, I will tell you who is to blame. Okay? And the first thing I want to tell you that the folks who are to blame are not from Serbia. Okay? Then I will say a few words about the prospects for the European economy, because that is the most relevant external factor for Serbia and for its neighbors. And there too, the news is not good, and in fact is especially bad. Now, this will not be new, but you might like some of these arguments anyway. And then finally, I'll talk briefly about the implications for all of this for emerging markets like Serbia. And again, to put things very, very briefly, there is trouble ahead. But the thing that Serbia can do to prepare is to be business ready. Right? So I want to start by saying that I will only talk briefly about the Serbian economy. So I should say that I think that Serbia has done very well to maintain macroeconomic stability, but what it needs most now is economic growth. And this will only happen if there's a massive increase in private investment. And for that, it has to become more ready for business than it has ever been. Okay? Now, I should say at the outset that I've been in the country just 24 hours on this visit, so you should treat what I say about Serbia with skepticism, okay? So I do have to say that in my defense, what I lack in knowledge about the country, I make up for with love for the country, because I have loved Serbia since 2009 when I first came here. There are so many reasons to love Serbia and Serbians. You are bright, you're dynamic, you're tough, you're good-humored, and you're hospitable. But I have a personal reason too, and that is that I'm a Sikh. We are the people who wear turbans on our heads, and we save MasterCard and other companies like that. But you may not know this, but Serbians and Sikhs have some characteristics in common. And some of these traits have got us both into trouble many, many times in the past, and they will undoubtedly do so again, and we will see, right? So while the prospects for emerging economies are difficult, there are lasting lessons from the period of global prosperity that we had between 1990 and 2015. These were the golden years of economic development, and I think it is useful to revisit them, so I will do so briefly. So I'm going to start by showing you a few charts. The first charts are on the global economy, right? So there are these three main findings. The first one is that we're going to have weak global growth in 2023 and next year. And the growth prospects of advanced economies are especially poor. And the growth prospects of emerging market and developing economies are better, but only because China is expected to rebound. And this is something that the governor also said. Okay. Now, so here's a slightly blurry slide. And what this tells you what the problem is. So global growth this year, we are forecasting it to be about 1.7%. But that doesn't mean anything, right? If you look at this chart, it starts to tell you what that means. It means that 2023, this year, might be the third worst non-recession year since 1990, okay? So it's one of the worst years that we've had in the last 30 years, right? And 2024 isn't going to be that much better, right? Now, so these are not good prospects, but even these are fragile, right? So they are fragile at best, and they're contractionary at worst. Now, you may say, how did the world get itself into such a big mess? So because it's a big mess, you have to look for big culprits, right? And we know that things were gradually getting worse in the years before COVID, but then there were three big policy mistakes, right? And these three big policy mistakes have been caused by the world's largest economies. And these are the US, China, and the Eurozone, right? And to oversimplify just a little, in the US, it was the result of misdiagnosing inflation. In China, it was the result of misdiagnosing the virus. And in Europe, it was the result of misdiagnosing the energy imperative. Okay? Now, in contrast, by the way, the economic policies in most emerging markets outside of China, and a few others like Turkey, have been generally solid, right? But emerging markets will pay the biggest price. They will pay the biggest price because, though they did not overuse their fiscal or their monetary stimuluses, despite the example of advanced economies and the advice of international institutions, they will pay more because they are poorer countries and they depend on the economy that is actually far more influenced by the advanced economies. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on each of these three big mistakes because there are lessons here. The first was that the US Federal Reserve and Treasury misread rising prices as transitory due to COVID-related disruptions in supply. By the time they realized that inflationary expectations were taking hold, it was too late to fix without risking a recession. Okay? Now, we should be kind in casting blame, because you will recall that the US Fed had for many years been fighting deflation, not inflation. And the central bankers here will appreciate that it's hard to shift quickly from that to fighting inflation instead, right? But even as the Fed started to tighten money, the US government was spending trillions more. So in real terms, federal spending in 2022 was $2 trillion more than in 2019, mainly as transfers to states and to households. So money was being pumped into the economy even as the supply of labor, services, and goods fell. Okay? Now you can be kind and conclude that this is understandable because we were fighting a pandemic and things were uncertain. But there's nothing kind about the effects of rapid monetary tightening on the treasuries and households in poorer countries. Higher financing costs are now hitting countries that had borrowed and spent, often with the encouragement of organizations like the IMF. Okay? And some of them are being hit very hard. Okay? Now, if you want to know how bad things can get if they get out of hand, remember what happened when Paul Volcker's Fed hiked up US interest rates in the 1970s and left a trail of bankrupt middle-income governments in Latin America and Asia. This could happen again, and it would mean many lost years of development, perhaps even a lost decade. Yeah. Now, the second big policy mistake was China's zero-COVID policy. China stayed with lockdowns all the way through 2022, losing $500 billion in growth in that year, right? And contributing to a lot more than that, perhaps, in terms of both demand and supply declines across the world. Now, China decided to go with zero COVID because, among other things, the Chinese-made vaccine Sinovac didn't work as well as expected. The government didn't want to admit this by importing Pfizer and Moderna and, God forbid, the Indian vaccine Covaxin. So these are again policy mistakes, and they can happen again. Now, with geopolitics now playing a bigger role, Chinese manufacturing is in trouble. This mistake is now being reversed, but the disruptions will continue, because many companies that had plants in China shut them down and began shifting operations to countries like India and Vietnam, and this will take time. Okay? Now, the third big policy mistake was in Western Europe, and this was revealed clearly it started to be revealed fairly clearly in mid-2022. So this was a rush to green the European economy as part of a worldwide push to fight climate change. Now, I think developing countries should be sympathetic to Western European countries that relied on Russian gas for the transition to low-carbon fuels. But we should acknowledge one thing that was made obvious in 2022. It was that a big part of Europe's success in cutting emissions until last year was natural gas, not renewables. Okay? So, by the way, I had always thought that the US had cheated in cutting emissions because it had moved massively from coal and oil into natural gas. So it had moved from fossil fuels to fossil fuels, right? And so I said, that's cheating, because what they should be doing is actually going from fossil fuels into renewables. What I didn't know is that Europe was doing much the same thing. Now, the best way to realize this is to take a close look at Germany's energy supplies. And if you look at that, you would know that things were pretty much the same on both sides of the Atlantic. So you keep hearing that Germany will speed up the transition to the transition to green sources of energy like solar and wind, and I'm sure that will happen, but it's important to keep some numbers in mind. So we hear, for example, that wind and solar now generate about 30% of the country's electricity output, which can quickly be pushed up to 50%. This is very impressive. But electricity itself accounts only for about a fifth of Germany's final energy consumption. In 2021, the share of wind and solar power in Germany's total final energy consumption, which includes heating, industrial processing, and traffic, was 6.7%. That's it, 6.7%. Okay? So Germany would not even come close to achieving energy autonomy, even if the renewable sector had expanded at 3 times the speed that it did. Okay? And now, Germany and others are buying natural gas from countries like Qatar and Algeria, which used to sell also to China, India, and Korea. So India, China are now buying gas from Russia. And that's causing all kinds of heartache in Europe, in the UK, and the US. And heartaches invariably lead to bad policy responses like trade-related punishments. Okay? The second thing that became clear to me is that energy security is a top goal of all developing countries, or should be a top goal for all developing countries, because it is the top goal of all advanced economies. So I think it's clear that the energy transition was derailed because this goal was not recognized as paramount until energy supplies fell short in countries not used to experiencing energy shortfalls, heating problems, and blackouts. Now, we should be kind in casting blame on Germany and others because the energy transition was triggered by global climate concerns, not narrow national interests. But there's nothing kind about the sharp rise in the price of fuels, fertilizers, and foods due to a vicious combination of disruptions. Okay? And this has led to all kinds of things like stockpiling natural gas in all parts of the world, as well as export bans on food grains in places like India. It's a mess. It's a mess all over the world. Okay? Now, we are seeing that these policy mistakes are being recognized, but it's hard to fix these mistakes quickly. In the meantime, the whole world will pay the price in slower growth, higher prices, and more economic uncertainty. Okay? Now, there is some room for optimism, right? I'm sorry that I've depressed you so far, so I'm going to try to cheer you up a bit now. Okay? But just for a bit. Okay? Okay. So the first thing that you see is that headline inflation is falling in many countries. And you start to sort of see, and because of this, it means that the price, that we should expect that interest rate hikes will also start to slow down. Okay? The other thing that has happened, of course, is that China is back in the market. So, for example, over here, you see that in 2021, that China was about half of all of the growth in emerging markets and developing economies, right? In 2022, what happened was that it fell to about a third, okay? And countries like India and all stepped up. And you see that in 2023, even though growth will be lower overall, China is back to half, right? But this is not the way things are going to be, because over time, China is going to be a smaller and smaller part of global growth. Right? Now, because of all of this stuff, as a result, things are actually not looking so good. So those two were the only good things that I'm going to say. Everything else is depressing. Okay. So excluding China, you see that GDP growth in emerging markets and developing economies is expected to slow from 3.8 in 2022 to 2.7 in 2023. That's a huge slice. Okay. The second thing is that income growth in these countries is projected to average less than 3%, and that's a full percentage point below what we saw in the decade, the decade that led up to the COVID crisis. And then the bad news keeps piling because private investments in these countries is expected to grow at only about 3.5% every year, which is less than half the rate of the previous 2 decades. And in 2023, international trade is expected to grow at less than 2%, which is about a third of the pace between 2010 and 2019. So all of these signs point to slowing growth across the developing world. So where does this leave us? Now, the first one is, of course, that it's hard to avoid the conclusion that Europe is the weakest spot in the world economy. Okay? I'm sorry, I skipped this chart, which shows that it shows what the average growth was in 2010, from 2010 to 2019, and what we expect the growth over these 5 years from 2020 to 2024 to be. And as you sort of see over here, in East Asia, it falls by half, in South Asia to it's fallen a lot, and in Europe and Central Asia as well. In sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see, is that what you see over here is that per capita income growth is going to fall to 0, according to our predictions. Okay, 0. Okay. Okay. Let me keep going. So I hope you guys are still with me. I can't see you because of all the flash of these lights. Okay. Now, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that Europe is the weakest spot in the world economy. And this is obvious from 3 sets of statistics. The first one is, of course, GDP growth. The second one are inflation rates, and the third one are real interest rates, right? So here's a table from the. Here's a table that I put together from both our own work as well as from the European Commission, and what it shows is that the world growth is going to fall by nearly about half from 2.9 in 2022 to about 1.7 this year. And if you see over here, advanced economies actually fall a lot more. And according to us, at least back in January, we were expecting the euro area to not grow at all, but to avoid I guess to actually not avoid a recession. But there are signs now that perhaps it will avoid the recession. However, you see this is very weak growth, even if it does do that. And as a result of it, this things are looking slightly better, but the risks of reversal remain high. The war and sanctions, stubborn inflation, and more interest rates hike, spreading debt crises and refugees, and food, fuel, and fertilizer prices that can destabilize governments. These are all immediate threats. Okay. Now, Europe will have a harder time than the United States and China. And to see why, I think the best example is that of monetary policy. So you see over here is that you see over here that the bars show what real policy rates were in the fourth quarter of 2021, and the dots show what the real policy rates were at the end of last year, right? And we want to see this to be positive because positive rates means effective monetary tightening, right? So if a policy rate is raised, but inflation rates are still high, then as a result of that, real interest rates may actually remain negative, and as a result of that, you don't get monetary tightening. And if you look at this chart, you see that in the United States, you actually do see within a year that you actually get a swing from negative real policy rates to positive. In the case of the G20 advanced economies, except the US and the euro area, which is the third bar, you see the same thing happening to a lesser degree. In the case of the G20 emerging markets, except Turkey, you actually see that they always actually had positive real interest rates, slightly positive, and now they've made them much higher. But in the case of the euro area, you see that real interest rates are still negative. Okay? Okay. And there's a good reason for this. The good reason for this, or the reason for this, is that when the Fed raises interest rates and does quantitative tightening, it doesn't have to care about less developed economies around the world. Okay? The ECB doesn't have this luxury because it has both advanced and somewhat less developed economies within the Eurozone. Okay? So the European Central Bank actually went about buying bonds the same way as the US Fed and flooded the market with money. The Fed has been selling off these bonds, but the ECB can't do the same thing easily because it has to worry about unemployment rates and borrowing costs in Germany and Greece at the same time, in Italy and France at the same time, and both in the Netherlands and Spain at the same time. And if it wants to push down inflation quickly, it has to push all of the Eurozone into recession. And that's the reason why you heard that inflation rates in Europe have only gone down just a little bit from about 10-point-something% to about 9-point-something%. So inflation is still high in the Eurozone, and the real interest rates are still negative. This means that there is more adjustment ahead for the euro area. This means that there's adjustment ahead for the rest of Europe as well. Okay. So where does this leave all of us? It leaves us with the policy implications for Serbia now. So the first one is, so it seems that the global economy will remain weak for the foreseeable future. Europe will remain the weakest part of the global economy, and the parts of Europe that are closest to Serbia in terms of economic relations are perhaps the weakest within the European Union as well. So all the signs point to especially low economic growth in countries like Germany, Italy, Romania, and Turkey, and all of these are important trade partners for Serbia. So what should countries like Serbia do? Now, the first is, of course, to learn the lessons of the past. So what got a lot of countries out of debt and low growth in the 1980s were a group of sensible policies that emphasized three things. Okay. So here's the reason why, So here's the reason why I say that growth should be the most important thing for Serbia. So these are per capita GDP growth rates in these four parts of the world: Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and the European Union. And as you can see, while there may or may not have been some convergence between Serbia and Croatia and others, but at this pace, it's going to take decades, if not centuries, right? So it has to be the natural order of things is that countries that start below others in terms of per capita income ought to be growing faster. You don't easily see that happening in this chart. Okay? Now, to go back to the lessons of the past, right? So if one looks at the period between 1990 and 2015, and don't just restrict it to Serbia, to take a look at countries across the world, you found that there was unprecedented poverty reduction in this time, from more than half of all people to less than a tenth in extreme poverty. This was not just in China and India, but pretty much every developing country that was not in conflict, okay? And there was unprecedented economic growth until 2010. There was rapid income convergence between poor and rich economies, and today 75% of the world lives in middle-income countries, not in poor countries, okay? There have been unprecedented improvements in the quality of life, in education, health, nutrition, in infant mortality and longevity. All of these indicators have gone the right way. The exception was the environment. There's been rising pollution, there's been accelerating climate change, there's been a depletion of natural resources, so obviously something needs to be done about that, and quickly, right? Now, what were the reasons for this? So the best of, to the best of my ability, I could sort of narrow it down to these four things. The first one was a recognition that macro stability was a sine qua non of all progress. That meant that you did not go overboard in terms of spending. You had balanced budgets. You had low debts. You did not resort to the inflation tax through expansive monetary policy. You exercised financial prudence. You did not suppress your financial sector, right? The second thing was that there was a recognition that it was the private sector that was going to lead the economy, not the government. It was not supposed to be state-owned enterprises. It was supposed to be the private sector, okay? And for this to happen, it was important to increase the tax base, not increase the marginal rates, and to increase the economic freedom that workers and entrepreneurs and others had. The second thing was to make sure that when one decides on the criteria for public investment, it should be investments that support the private sector activities, okay? And then the third thing was that these two things, by the way, the first one is macro stability and the second one is private investment. When you institute these two things, you immediately get a supply response in a country. In country after country, you start to see a certain thing. The problem is that countries become suppliers before they become demanders, okay? They become suppliers of things before they become markets. So as a result, they need to actually sell those things somewhere. And what happened during the period 1990 and 2015 was this massive growth of international trade, as well as movements of foreign capital into these markets, okay? And so as a result of this, you got a whole lot of, and then the people who could not participate in these things because they were too poor, because they were too old, or because they were too unhealthy, there were lots of innovations in social protection to make sure that you looked after them as well. So these were the reasons for all of the things that I mentioned about those improving standards of living and lower poverty rates and higher levels of per capita income. So in some sense, you have to sort of take those things and try to sort of see, is there something that we need to learn? Is there something that one recreates? By the way, the words that I didn't use in those slides here and so on was something called the Washington Consensus, by the way. So if you actually look, if you look at that list of things, you'll actually find that the Washington Consensus was not a complete set of things that were required, but a very sensible set of things that were necessary. Okay? So things that were not sufficient, but things that were necessary. So I think in some sense, what I would say to the Serbian people and the Serbian policymakers is that you know, heed the lessons of that past. So I would actually say three things for Serbia. First is heed these lessons. The second is to recognize that for middle-income economies like Serbia, being near the European Union has been good. Being a candidate for accession to the EU is better, and being in the EU is best. Okay? So I think it is very good that Serbia has set its eyes on accession to the EU. But then there is a third factor, and the third factor actually has to recognize the reality as it is today, and that is to factor in the current environment. And there are two important aspects here. The first is the additional complication caused by geopolitical tensions. This will put additional pressure on countries that have relations or that want relations with countries like Russia, China, as well as want relations with the EU and the US and other countries as well at the same time. Now, picking sides may not be in the DNA of countries in the former Yugoslavia, just like it is not in the DNA of countries like India, because we tended to be non-aligned. We did not want to take sides. So it may well be that countries like Serbia will also have to balance these objectives. Of course, the second pressure, which is a legitimate pressure, is the pressure to accelerate the energy transition. So countries that have a lot of coal, especially low qualities of coal, have tough choices ahead because of climate change concerns. And Serbia has to manage all of this. It has no choice. Right? Now, what does Serbia have? Serbia is a beautiful country. Serbia has a dynamic, efficient, hospitable, and resilient people. But then I think about it and I look closely at the Serbian economy and I say, do I detect the same attributes of dynamism, of resilience, of independence and freedom and so on in the way that the Serbian economy is structured? And I don't always see that very clear match. Okay? And so what exactly explains this paradox? The fact that Serbian people have certain attributes and the Serbian economy as yet doesn't? I don't know. But I think that the main implication of this gap in the attributes of the economy and the attributes of Serbians is that Serbians will be successful regardless, but the Serbian economy may not be successful. Okay? So the most talented Serbians will leave, Serbians will succeed, and Serbia will not. Okay? So I should stop over here because I think I don't know if I've depressed you or if I've inspired some of you or not, but so I think that I should stop here because I can take some questions from you, or I can help the organizers catch up to the schedule. Up to you.